world. This is Stefan of Lendergan Games. I don't have anything to show you this time around as I've shifted my work from the game portion to the video portion. Specifically, I've started working on walking animations. So I'm sorry there's not much to report this time around. So here's the ramble. I was surprised to find that I had so much to say about these games, even after reflecting and factoring in that with bigger games, the better ones have more features to discuss. Still, this is almost double the length of my previous ramble. So, without any further ado, number 22, Diablo II. Diablo II is a fantasy hack and slash game with upgrading elements. Pinning down why it sits so highly with me is almost impossible, because a lot of its strength comes from nailing down so many small details. For example, targeting specific enemies in a mob is a precise art, and Condor Games had figured out a method of knowing whom you're targeting without further cluttering the battlefield. Another small touch is the ability to recolor armor. Is it necessary? No. Is it welcome? Absolutely. I can't say much about the larger things because combat repetition and skill trees either sit well with the player or don't. And I can't say anything about how character building affects combat that hasn't already been said by so many other people. I will freely say, though, that I never finished the Battle of Attrition, that is, bragging rights difficulty, and I don't care to attain those bragging rights. Diablo 2 lets you play through normal and hard with whatever haphazard character build catches your fancy, and for that I applaud it. Of course, now that I've licked Diablo 2's boots, I had to talk about Diablo 3. I originally hated it for existing because upon learning that Condor Games had left during development and upon seeing Diablo 3 come out as a hand-holding arcade brawler and then reading about Blizzard's EA-grade shenanigans, I thought that corporate meddling itself had ruined the game. It was later that I learned that Condor had left because of disagreements with Vivendi instead of Blizzard, and that piece of information immediately shifted my perception more charitably in regards to the game. I recently bought the Ultimate Evil Edition for Xbox 360 because the console versions don't suffer from lag and server errors, and I view it similarly to 4th edition of Dungeons and Dragons. It's great for being baby's first hack and slash. It even lets you play as a Scooby-Doo villain that throws frogs and spiders at meddling kids. Number 23, The Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall. Daggerfall is a fantasy action role-playing game that takes place in a sandbox the size of Ireland. My introduction to it was a demo that took place on the tiny island of Bethany that is actually bigger than the game world in Breath of the Wilds. What first got my attention in Daggerfall is the level of detail to which a player can customize a character. Is he good with swords? Is he good with axes? Is he good with ebony daggers? Can he climb quickly? Can he run without tiring himself out? Can he negotiate with demons? Can he negotiate with dragons? Can he pick locks? Can he pick pockets? Can he move quietly? Daggerfall is impressive in the same way that ancient Roman architecture is. It's not elegant, but it is huge. Daggerfall has about a half dozen guilds that characters can join and in which climb ranks. It has a couple dozen countries, each with anywhere from 1 to 6 major cities and an exponentially scaling number of towns and dungeons. I admit that I've never beaten the game. The main reason for that is because every time I play, I want to join ranks with the King of Worms, meaning that I inevitably have to pass through a switch puzzle that I don't have the patience to solve. After aggravating over that for a bit, I move on to another game. Number 24, Z. Z is a real-time strategy game where armies are robots and the immediate goal is to capture command points. The mechanics for Z still intrigue me and they still stand out from the plague of samey strategy mechanics. Instead of mining for gold or food or love or whatnot and using that commodity to buy soldiers, The resource is time, discounted by how many command points you control. More powerful units take more time to produce, so you have to wager whether or not you can afford to wait for it as you race towards capturing and defending outposts. The idea of a competitive race to become king of the hill makes the scenario tense from the beginning, and it really is more exciting to start a war game with conquering land instead of rolling wheelbarrows. Number 25, Legend of Mana. Legend of Mana is a beat 'em up game with light role playing sprinkled in that takes place in an intellectually migraine inducing world in a vein parallel to Gareth the Goblin King's domain. On that note, the answer because video game really needs to be separated from the answer because plot. How does lobbing a sundial into a grassy knoll create an entire town? Because video game. Unlike with plot devices, video games can maintain immersion with moon logic mechanics as long as the moon logic remains consistent and the player doesn't need to consult game facts to figure out what to do with the next sundial. Besides the dreamlike vibe from the game, including the series' commitment to belly dancing innkeepers, the combat also is gorgeous. Attack combos are rhythmic and fluid, and the number of animations is multiplied by 11 weapons, each with their own rhythm. As well, the customizability of fighting is also astounding. The controls consist of a light attack, a heavy attack, 2 buttons for whatever tactical maneuvers you want, such as jumping, rolling, the do-si-do, and whatnot, and then 2 more buttons for hand-picked special attacks. Each of the weapons have a dozen or so special attacks to learn, each with their own benefits and limitations. There's definitely something to be said about a beat-em-up game where you form your playing style instead of being handed one. Number 26, Rayman! Rayman is a platforming game that spans artistic themes instead of geography. The goal of the game is to both find and free 100 or so wisps, by any other name, that are trapped in cages. That find part is just as important to remember as is the part about freeing, especially near the end where you can't fight the final boss because you haven't freed enough wisps. Regardless, the visuals from the various zones still stick out to me, as well as does the soundtrack for most of them. Looking back, I used to keep coming back for individual levels, since many of them are just a blast to play. I never did beat the game or even get to the last boss. After scouring levels of wisps to free, I called quits on that after tripping over Jimmy Hoffa's corpse. Number 27, Star Gladiator! Star Gladiator is a dueling fighting game that takes place in space. With its combo tree and half-dozen alien races, I can't help but imagine the possibilities that can be done with simply expanding on what's already there. The combo tree already lends itself to accomplishing something that Soul Calibur 3 almost achieved, creating a truly custom character that isn't just a reskin of established characters. I've also put mental energies into figuring out an animation framework for it. As well, the cast can be multiplied simply by making 2 or 3 more characters for each race, which would also, as a side effect, make the galaxy a bigger place. Now you can see how easily my ideas spiral out of my grasp. Number 28, Take No Prisoners! Take No Prisoners is a top-down shooter that takes place in a post-apocalyptic San Antonio across various interconnected levels. I love the way that non-linearity is handled in Take No Prisoners. Almost every area is connected to 2 or 3 other levels, with the exits being forms of transportation, namely trains, trucks, and boats. Even the opening prison level has a hidden exit for the hardcore players who enjoy the challenge of fighting mutants without a flamethrower. Similarly, the game provides simply an overarching objective of breaking into point B, grabbing the MacGuffin, returning to point A, leaving you, the player, to figure out the necessary steps to get to point B. Back to the flamethrower, Raven Software did a good job of using diverse damage types to add further depth to the differences between enemies. Mutants have tough skin, but burn easily. Ed 209 is armored against everything except tasers. Soldiers are specialized and fire you with specific weapons of choice. Cultist zealots yell Leroy Jenkins and run at you with a sword, while mystics jump around and throw shurikens and traps at you. You can read all about them in your PDA too, and I enjoy just scrolling through that and looking at all the descriptions for weapons, enemies, armors, and items. Number 29, Crusader No Remorse. Crusader No Remorse is a dystopian isometric shooter that stars an elite soldier who rampages through the factories and offices that he used to protect. I don't know how intentional this was, but I enjoy the walk and gun rhythm of the game, as opposed to run and gun, of just strolling through a factory, seeing a security guard blasting away the gasoline barrel next to him, and watching him die in a screaming, frenzied, fiery blaze. Then I pick up the ammo that he dropped and continue my self-guided tour. Number 30, Fallout 1 and 2. Fallout 1 and 2 are role-playing games with tactical turn-based combat. My first admiration for the game, I use a singular because I love both games for the same reason, is its devotion to the grit of a post-apocalyptic world. Everything is dirty and the sealed chambers that are clean are unsettling. The game doesn't have a soundtrack, but instead horrific ambiance. Everything can die horribly and everyone can get utterly debilitated if hit in the right spot. Shooting someone in the eye or the crotch is completely unethical, but the world is so run down and morally gray that the only unrecommended moves are the ones that don't end the fight in your favor. What kind of motivation does a roleplay hero have in a morally gray world then? Well, he certainly doesn't have to save it. And after playing so many role-playing games, I reflexively give Fallout respect for that. Granted, he is trying to save something, but it amounts to trying to get the water turned back on for his house. Even when he fights the big bad wolf, he has to do it because the big bad wolf threatens his home. Yes, leaving the rest of the world in an even more ruined wreck is a valid option in Fallout. In fact, Fallout's commitment to role-playing is another noteworthy aspect. Every story is unfinished, and few endings are objectively better than others. Yes, the casino owner is breaking laws, but do you really want to help Sheriff Feelgood when he's standing in the way of the town's financial prosperity? Yes, the mercenaries have declared themselves despots of a town, but how long would the town last under protection of the Buttercream Gang? Yes, the raiders sell slaves, but at this point, do morals even matter? Number 31, Warlords 3, Dark Lords Rising! Warlords 3 is a turn-based strategy game with upgrading elements and set in a fantasy world. The first thing that comes to mind whenever I think back on Warlords 3 is the artwork. Linked with every soldier type and both genders of every hero type is a beautiful piece of fantasy art. After that comes the actual gameplay, with small dungeons strewn across each map for heroes to pillage so that they can dig up magical artifacts to help them in the battle already at hand. I don't care if it makes the hero seem like a cat distracted by a shiny object, I love that part of the hero life. Number 32, Escape Velocity Override! Escape Velocity Override is both a space trading game with buy low, sell high mechanics similar to Drug Wars, and a space combat game. What really tickles my fancy is how the wars in space are implemented. Even while running errands or doing a mule run, you often come across skirmishes between warring factions or raiders that just want to harass everybody. Second part of the implementation are the scripted large-scale battles. Ambroge's software did a good job of balancing the odds so that your ship can turn the tide of battle, but can't win the day by itself. Even with the warship that I previously hijacked, I still needed the rest of the army to achieve victory. Oh yeah, you can punch holes in engines and steal ships in this game. That's a great touch. Number 33, Destrega! Destrega is basically a wizard dueling game. I give this game instant credit for giving a new perspective, take that however literally you want, to one-on-one combat. Instead of moving just left and right and possibly sidestepping for supposed three-dimensional depth, combatants in Destrega run around in arenas, all of which provide elements of verticality and cover from spells. I say spells, but it's all roughly equivalent to Saiyan blasts from Dragon Ball that do nothing but punch holes in things. The only difference in Destrega, and the only difference that it needs really, is that each character's class look and behave differently from each other. On a side note, this game is the inspiration for my first idea of a heavy metal game, based around the notion that running around an arena provides much more potential for collateral destruction than the Tekken or Guilty Gear formula would. Number 34, Breath of Fire 3! Breath of Fire 3 is a narrative-driven adventure game with turn-based combat. It is also a perfect game. My completely objective definition for a perfect game is where I discern that if I could change any one thing about a game, I would change nothing. Let's start with the combat. Specifically, let's dissect how Capcom magically made menu-based combat feel fluid and organic. For starters, unlike most JRPGs, Breath of Fire 3's combat takes place where the characters are standing. If they're walking through the woods, they fight in those woods. If they're rummaging through an office, they fight in that office. If they're crawling through an air vent, they fight in that air vent. You can drop a stopwatch when your characters get stopped for combat, and by the time it hits the ground, everybody's armed and ready to fight. Once you're fighting, the combat menu itself is laid out ingeniously. Instead of a list, the options are laid out in a radial menu with the basic attack in the middle, so no option is more than a direction and a button press away. A further great touch is that double tapping the appropriate direction counts as selecting the option. Additionally, the left and right shoulder buttons are respectively tied to tactical retreat and charge of the light brigade. That way, after your party has robbed a boss blind and depleted his magic reserves, you can tell them to shout Leroy Jenkins and slap away at him with reckless abandon while you go get yourself some more snacks. Yes, you can rob enemies in this game if you have the appropriate skills. One more thing that makes combat feel more organic, besides monsters having their own tactics, is the ability to interact with them in ways other than punching holes in them from start to finish. Two things extra to gain from random encounters are loot and special abilities. Unlike stealing loot, special abilities are acquired from monsters through a risk-reward action called Observe. Essentially, the observer risks getting pummeled for a chance to figure out whether he can learn a special attack. Yes, that's assuming that the observed monster even uses a special move that turn, but overcoming all of the variables and consequently broken jaws adds to the sweetness of adding to your library of tactical possibilities. That now brings us to the Masters mechanic. Because every character has predetermined strengths and weaknesses, Breath of Fire 3 doesn't have classes. However, if a character becomes a protege for a master, his stat bonuses from gaining levels is changed, and he gradually gains access to special abilities that he would otherwise be unable to acquire. That said, the playable characters are already solid from the outset, especially the main character Vlad Dracul. Capcom did an amazing job of making the hero of this story as necessary mechanically as he is narratively. First off, he's a healer. Every party in every role-playing game needs a healer. And because Capcom relegated that role to the only person who can't be switched out, that leaves the player free to fill up the other two slots with preferences instead of necessities. Secondly, he's a dragon, the titular fire breather. Even if he could be switched out, why would you not enlist a dragon when one is available? As for the rest of the cast, I can encapsulate my general praise, because this is already far lengthier than I expected, with my thoughts on Momo, my first ever 2D crush. In short, she's a woman with Asperger's and an answer to the question, who's the man with the master plan? At length, she's an engineer who inherited from her father a curiosity for how things work. She fits the ever-elusive title of strong female character because she has her own backbone, her own personality, and her own limitations. In terms of suspending disbelief, she earns being more nimble and doing more damage as the muscle-bound war veteran because she fires a cannon that she likely made herself. On the flip side, she also misses a lot of shots because she's firing a cannon. As well, beyond just the character concepts, the writing in general for Breath of Fire 3 is noteworthy. I'm not going to make any comparisons to Charles Dickens, but I do place noteworthy writing on a pedestal because I consider Plus to be rather vestigial to gaming in the same way that I would in relation to sports.
Aside from the plot points themselves, all of writing in regards to the characters takes place when setting up camp. My first point of appreciation is that the dialogue in camps are completely optional, unlike, for example, Dragon Age, where conversations in camp can lead to combat bonuses and therefore aren't completely optional. My second thumbs up is that while the dialogues are functionally expositional, the characters aren't just relaying what happens next, but are instead reacting to what happens next, revealing how they each view the world. The princess sees the situation differently from how the war veteran sees it, who sees it differently than how does the engineer, who reacts differently than does the walking onion. As for the overall plot itself, like Fallout, it isn't save the world, and that's automatically a plus for me. Even better, Smaug himself has something personally to gain from the journey. Even in the end, the world remains unsaved from some big baddie because the writers at Capcom maintained retrospectively admirable restraint. I've got so much more that I love about the game, but I'm just going to end it with the mini games. They serve a very useful function of refreshing the palate before releasing the player back to the core gameplay loop of turn-based homicide. Some of the mini games are more enjoyable than others, yes, but I don't count any of them as a flaw because the infuriating ones thoroughly refresh the palate. Then, outside of plot-related minigames, is fishing. Breath of Fire 3 has the best and best implemented fishing minigame ever created. Granted, I'm no connoisseur of fishing minigames, but I have come across plenty of them. With the nuts and bolts, Breath of Fire 3 recreates the act of luring, snagging, properly reacting to, and forcibly overpowering an unsuspecting foe. Then, on top of that, there are fish markets scattered across various beaches that trade exclusively for fish. Meaning that if you want that holy dagger, you'll have to figure out how to catch the fish that the creature from the Black Lagoon wants for it. Topping it off are the fish themselves. They can also be sold for real money or eaten for various benefits. You don't even have to do that. You're not in any actual hurry. The world's in no danger. Just make yourself a tall glass of iced tea. Take your happy little rod out to the happy little lake. Toss your happy little line out and make yourself a new friend. Go ahead and make some extra friends too. You don't want them to be lonely.